In the autumn of 1891, Edvard Munch travelled to Paris and then onwards to Nice to spend the winter there. At first he lived in the city centre, but early in 1892 he moved in with the painter Christian Skretsvik and his wife, who had rented a small villa in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, a more rural location. It was while he was in Nice on January 22nd, 1892, that Munch wrote the first prose poem in his diary in connection with the scream motif. Around the same time he painted what he called the first scream, the picture titled Despair. Many years later, Skretsvik wrote in his memoirs Days and Nights Among the Artists.
For a long time he had wanted to paint his memory of a sunset, red as blood. No, it was coagulated blood, but nobody else would have felt as he did. They would only have thought of clouds. He talked sadly about this experience that had gripped him with terror. Sadly, because the inadequate medium of painting would not be able to serve his needs. He is striving after the impossible, and has despair as his religion, I thought, but I advised him to paint it, and so he painted his remarkable Scream.
It is worth noting that this memory materialized while he was in Nice, perhaps as a result of the spectacular winter sunsets on the Mediterranean. In fact, Munch also painted the picture while he was in Nice, far from Christiania, now Oslo. The motive was probably composed from a combination of remembered perspectives and views that Munch expressed in his own striking and evocative way. It is thus pointless to try and identify one particular place on the Ekeberg Hill as a single source of this motive. Despair was shown at the infamous and scandalous exhibition in Berlin in November 1892, and at the Equitable Palast in the same city around New Year 1892-93. A few months later, the final version of the motif emerged with a strange, distorted scream figure in the foreground. Munch probably produced it first in pastel, in a version now owned by the Munch Museum, and then in the first painted version, which is found in the National Museum in Oslo. 2 years later, industrialist and art collector Arthur von Francke from Braunschweig in Germany was eager to buy Despair, which he had seen exhibited in Berlin. In 1895, Eugen von Francke wrote to Munch on his brother's behalf, saying that he had recently seen the Scream at an exhibition in Berlin, and that his brother, Arthur, wanted to buy the related painting Despair. Von Francke probably purchased Despair and also commissioned a pastel from Munch that in its composition appears to be a synthesis of the two motifs, and follows the narrative development of Munch's prose poem, the friend who continues along the road, the figure leaning against the railing, deadly tired, and finally, the scream. Arthur von Francke was an enthusiastic admirer of Munch's prose poem, and at the bottom of the simple frame of the pastel work, Munch fastened a small plaque with a shorter, handwritten version of the poem. Munch most likely also showed von Francke his diary containing the poem from Nice in 1892, and on the back of the pastel, von Francke himself noted down the first version of the poem in both Norwegian and a German translation. Munch also made a lithograph version of the motif in 1895. Arthur von Francke also bought one of these, and on the back of which he meticulously transcribed both the short version and the original prose poem in Norwegian and German. The lithograph version of the Scream was reproduced in a number of contemporary sources, for instance on book covers and in journals, often accompanied by the short prose poem. Reproductions of the lithograph version helped to establish the iconic status of the motif early on. Little is known about Arthur von Francke and his further history. His art collection was probably sold in the early 1920s. Munch's old friend Ernst Thiel bought Despair at some point, and it is now found in the Thielska Galleriet in Stockholm. The pastel was owned by Jewish banker Hugo Simon of Berlin in 1926. He loaned it to several exhibitions, including Mannheim in 1926 and Chemnitz and Leipzig in 1929, where the prose poem on the back of the picture was printed in the catalogue to serve as a key to the motif. Hugo Simon was forced to flee Germany for Paris in 1933 and tried to sell the picture at an auction in Amsterdam that year, but surprisingly it was not sold. He loaned it to Kunsthaus Zürich in 1936, and in 1937 he sent it on commission to an art dealer in Stockholm. Finally, the Norwegian shipowner Thomas Olsen bought the pastel for his private collection. It remained in the Olsen family until it recently was sold at an auction in New York. The other painted version of the Scream is owned by the Munch Museum. There has been a good deal of controversy through the years, both within the professional circles and in the press, as to the date it was painted. It was previously dated to 1893 and thus regarded as contemporary with the first pastel and painting. Now, however, it is believed that Munch painted the second version around 1910, when he sold the first painting to collector Olav Skau, who immediately donated the picture to the National Gallery in Oslo. Although Munch kept the first pastel in his private collection, perhaps he felt the need for a more vibrantly colored version of a motif that played such a significant role in his frieze of life, the series that he was continually expanding on and experimenting with. There is no information as to how much Arthur von Francke paid Munch for the pastel in 1895, and perhaps it is time to forget about the art market, sales and money value, and focus on the artwork in itself. Maybe it is still possible to understand von Francke's deep fascination with the disturbingly expressive and evocative motif, accompanied by the profoundly relentless prose poem. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting, the sky turned blood red, and I felt a wave of sadness. I paused, tired to death. Above the blue-black fjord and city, blood and flaming tongues hovered. My friends walked on. I stayed behind, quaking with angst, and I felt the great scream in nature.